It's Friday the 7th of July and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by our reporter Kemlyn Davis in Cardiff and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. On the programme this week, the NHS celebrates its 75th birthday as MPs debate the workforce plan.
We will double the number of medical school places. We'll increase the number of GPs being trained by 50%.
Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, at its heart, this is Labour's workforce plan.
The NHS dominates the agenda in the Senedd too.
The challenges remain, but I stand committed, along with my fellow Welsh Labour colleagues and progressives across this Senedd, to the greatest socialist ideal ever enacted in this country, our NHS.
The Prime Minister is grilled by MPs at the Liaison Committee.
Have you apologised to the House yet?
As I said, I continue to be in Parliament to answer members' questions on a range of issues, making statements on a range of topics, and will continue to do so.
But you're not coming to Prime Minister's questions tomorrow, are you, or next week?
So this week it was the turn of the deputies.
I'm glad to see the right honourable gentleman here today. I think I'm right in saying that I have the pleasure again next week, 2 weeks on the trot. They really have given up.
It may come as a surprise to the right honourable lady, but actually some leaders trust their deputies to stand in for them.
And the government faces criticism over plans to fine public bodies that initiate boycotts against Israel.
The BDS movement deliberately asks public bodies to treat Israel differently from any other nation on the globe.
This bill is not a considered attempt to bring about peace, provide better security for Israel, or respond to the threats posed by BDS. It's about using Jews as a pawn in the government's political game.
Well, Susan, it was a big week for the NHS as it celebrated its 75th anniversary, but the week started with MPs debating the workforce plan. Now, that was after it was announced at a press conference first. How did it go down in the Commons?
Well, the plan itself went down pretty well. I suppose this is really the birthday present the NHS might have wanted, because at the moment we've got something like 1 in 10 posts unfilled. And of course, it takes a long time to train NHS staff, you know, a good 5 years to train a doctor. So this is the government trying to be a bit more strategic, to think 10, 15 years ahead. How many doctors and nurses we'll need then? The Prime Minister called it the biggest ever expansion in the number of doctors and nurses we train. But as you say, he said that outside of the Commons. When it came to the Commons, because of course that is where these big announcements are meant to be made first, the Speaker started off with a bit of a harumph.
I thank the Secretary of State for coming here to make the statement. It's a pity the Prime Minister hadn't done so on Friday, where the world was meant to hear it before we do. The Prime Minister is a Member of Parliament. He's answerable to the Members of Parliament from all political parties. And I've got to say, it is not acceptable. He may well be the Prime Minister, but the Members of Parliament should hear it first. So I'm very pleased the Secretary of State is doing it the right way.
The plan sets out 3 priorities: to train more staff, to retain and develop the staff already working for the NHS, and to reform how training is delivered, taking on board the best of international practice. And let me deal with each in turn. We will double the number of medical school places. We'll increase the number of GPs being trained by 50%. We will train 24,000 more nurses and midwives, and we'll increase the number of dentists by 40%.
Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, at its heart, this is Labour's workforce plan. A plan we've called for since last September. A plan we have begged them to adopt again and again. They say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, and I, for one, am relieved they've finally seen sense. But the question the Health Secretary and honourable members opposite need to answer today is what on earth took them so long? Yet the Secretary of State has completely failed to put forward a proper plan to end the crippling strikes that are having such a huge impact on patient care. 650,000 operations and appointments have been cancelled under industrial action.
I want to ask the Secretary of State, what's the point of a workforce plan if he's not actually talking to the workforce? When will he talk to the junior doctors and the consultants?
We reached agreement with the NHS Staff Council. Those sums, the 5% plus the lump sum in recognition of their tremendous work is going into pay packets this month. So we have reached agreement, but it is the case, notwithstanding discussions with the junior doctors, they still demand 35%, and that is not affordable.
But would you agree with me that there are two things that are needed for implementation? One is to improve the sense of culture in the NHS, which could lead to better retention. And the second element is ensuring that digital innovation, particularly around artificial intelligence, to improve clinical skills and other skills, is rolled out more generally in the NHS.
There is a requirement, it's something the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Sir Chris Whitty, has spoken about, in the need for more generalist skills within the NHS, not least given 1 in 4 adults now have 2 or more health conditions. So those more generalist skills, we need the flexibility to respond not just to changes in technology, but also service design, which will evolve as well. But he's also right about the wider issues of culture. I think the whole House was concerned around recent reports around sexual assaults linked to the NHS. One of the key features of the agreement that we reached with NHS Staff Council is to work more in partnership in terms of violence against members of NHS staff, which again I know there'll be a consensus in the House is unacceptable, and so we're working with trade union colleagues as to how we tackle that.
He will remember that at the start of this year people were dying in the back of ambulances and in hospital corridors, in part because people could not be discharged from hospitals into social care. If the government believes, as I do, that you cannot fix the NHS if you don't fix social care, will the Secretary of State bring forward a workforce plan for our social care sector too?
We committed, the Chancellor committed in the autumn statement, up to £7.5 billion of further investment over 2 years, and part of our reforms was to better integrate health and social care.
In 50 years' time, it will take a fifth of all of our GDP. This is totally unsustainable, especially as you're only right, despite the fact you're paying ever-increasing amounts of tax to join the back of a queue. So I ask again, will the Secretary of State launch a study, if necessary appoint a Royal Commission, on fundamental reform of the whole nature and funding of our health system, so that we can learn from every other developed country, from Australia, from France, Italy and Germany, where they unleash private sector investment into healthcare and give people rights to their healthcare while ensuring that those who need it get free healthcare at the point of delivery.
Well, another issue that dominated at the beginning of the week was fuel, in particular the price of it. What did we learn?
Well, we learnt that ministers and MPs are pretty fed up about it. If you have driven across the country recently, you'll know that the prices you pay do vary a lot across the country and that you do actually pay quite a lot everywhere. Now, a report from the Competition and Markets Authority has said that the big 4 supermarkets, which are traditionally the places where you got a pretty good deal on fuel, have hiked up their profit margins since the pandemic. So they made an extra £900 million out of consumers last year. The CMA says that is a lack of transparency, a lack of competition. And one of the solutions is to try and make that clearer so that we can vote with our wheels, and if you know that it's cheaper down the road, you can go there. But there was a great deal of crossness in the Commons about it.
Today, the CMA published its final market study report, and I'm shocked by its findings. It is completely unacceptable, Mr. Speaker, that consumers have been paying more, with the financial impact of the 6 pence per litre increase just in the fuel margin from 2019 to 2022, resulting in costs of £900 million to customers of just the 4 supermarket fuel retailers last year alone. Mr. Speaker, motorists should not be used as cash cows by the fuel industry. The government will not stand for it. I know this House won't stand for it. Therefore, we accept the CMA's recommendations in full, We will create a statutory open data scheme for retail fuel prices and an ongoing road fuel prices monitoring function for the UK market.
Mr Speaker, I'm extremely grateful. I'm delighted to see the Minister. Disappointed not to see the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I would have thought this would be something that he cared about. Why did the government fail to stop greedy retailers from hitting families with an almost £1 billion excess fuel bill in the first place? Will the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, summon those companies' bosses to Downing Street and press them to return those unfair profits by lowering their prices now? And will he expand the Rural Fuel Duty Relief Scheme to more areas to support communities like mine struggling with the highest petrol prices?
Given the then Business Secretary wrote to fuel retailers and the CMA over a year ago to highlight apparent unfairness in fuel prices, why has it taken so long for the government to take action on this issue? Motorists did not need a report from the CMA to tell them that they are being fleeced by fuel retailers. They can see it every time they fill up at the pump.
Now, I'm all for this open fuel data finder scheme, but really, is that it? I already use an app myself to shop around for cheaper fuel prices, so this open data won't necessarily bring in competition in all areas of the UK, and obviously our reliance on app doesn't help those who are digitally excluded. And so what's the government's actual plans to ensure competition and reduce fuel prices, especially for motorway service stations which are 20 to 30 pence per litre higher? When are we going to see these fuel prices come down?
A couple of weeks ago, I drew the House's attention to the fact that the same supermarket tanker would unload fuel at 10 pence a litre cheaper than it would coming 10 to 15 miles up the road to my constituency. If this report today does not fix that, frankly, it will not have been good enough, and the government will have more work to do.
Now, the Prime Minister did not attend Prime Minister's questions this week, but MPs did get a chance to grill Rishi Sunak at the liaison committee. What came up?
Yeah, this happens around 3 times a year where he's grilled by these senior MPs. I suspect it's not something that Prime Ministers particularly enjoy, even when things are going swimmingly. And Rishi Sunak, of course, does have a lot on his plate. It's the economy, cost of living, some political difficulties in his party, and, of course, his promise to stop those small boat crossings in the Channel with the threat of sending people to Rwanda. That's run into some trouble with the courts. They've said it's illegal. The government's appealing that, but there were questions about whether that really was still a viable plan. And also, he was asked about whether he's trying to avoid tricky sessions in the Commons. Let's have a look.
I know you're appealing the Court of Appeal's ruling on the Rwanda scheme. You've said this policy is an important part of your plan to tackle illegal migration and stop small boats. So do you have a plan for what you'll do if the appeal fails?
As I said, our belief remains that the plan that we have is legal, it's compliant with all our obligations, and we'll be appealing it vigorously. And if you look at the ruling, what you'll see is the Lord Chief Justice, in his opinion, agreed with the High Court and with the government that the safeguards and reassurances that we have received from Rwanda are sufficient. There's a very specific point of contention about the onward relocation, potentially, of people who we send to Rwanda. And so we believe that the safeguards we have are sufficient, so we'll continue to confidently and vigorously pursue our case.
So you're betting everything on the Rwanda policy being upheld in the Supreme Court?
Well, no, that's not a fair characterisation of what we're doing.
Well, it's a gamble, isn't it? You're not sure.
Last year and indeed this year, I set out a range of things we're doing to tackle this problem.
Yes.
So, for example...
Can I come on to that? Because I've got some specific questions of what you're going to say.
Just answer, because you answered the question. It could be a very substantive additional piece, is the new deal that we have with Albania.
Yeah,
Albania
with the greatest respect, Prime Minister, I've got very little time and I do want to get through some important issues with you. So if I could just leave that, I got your
I think you made
response.
A statement that we're betting the House on one thing. I think it's reasonable for me to say, well, let me give you an example of something else.
The illegal migration bill, which was introduced earlier this year, since the bill was introduced, 8,128 people have crossed the Channel in small boats. So if we assume your Rwanda policy is upheld in the Supreme Court, Rwanda has said they can take a capacity of 500 people. So that leaves 7,628 who've come across since the bill was introduced. What do you intend will happen to those people?
As I said, I'm not going to talk about a private commercial contract that we have, but our Rwanda scheme, as we have said multiple times, is uncapped.
Okay.
So I think
That's
that is
not what
important.
the Rwandans say,
well,
is it?
Well, the Rwanda scheme is uncapped,
Okay.
and which is why I believe it can act as a very helpful deterrent when the scheme is up and running.
The Ministerial Code says when Parliament is in session, the most important announcements of government policy should be made in the first instance in Parliament. So why did you announce the NHS workforce plan, not in Parliament, but outside Parliament?
I've always tried to announce what I can in Parliament. I think my track record, and the Speaker's always said in the past that I particularly have done that. Where that's not possible, or the statement is made immediately thereafterwards, particularly in
you
areas...
announced it last Friday.
I think particularly where it's worth considering that this is not just the government's plan, it's also the NHS's plan.
You could have announced it in Parliament on Monday, couldn't you?
Well, as I said, this involved not just the government, it involved also the NHS. Because it was the NHS's long-term workforce plan. The government was pleased to support it and proud to support it, and it's a plan that will do something special for the NHS in this 75th year.
Have you apologised to the House yet?
As I said, I continue to be in Parliament to answer members' questions on a range of issues, making statements on a range of topics, and will continue to do so.
But you're not coming to Prime Minister's questions tomorrow, are you, or next week?
Yes, because I am attending the 75th anniversary celebration for the NHS.
And you decided when that should be, so you could have had it tomorrow evening or tomorrow morning?
No, again, that's not right. I did not decide when that was, and quite frankly, even if it was on a different day, also because His Majesty is in Scotland on Wednesday, it might have been reasonable for me to be there as well. And with regard to the week afterwards, I'm also at the NATO summit.
Remind us when a Prime Minister
I don't know whether is the honourable gentleman suggesting that I shouldn't attend the NATO summit on behalf of the United Kingdom, as previous Prime Ministers have done.
Remind us when a Prime Minister last missed two Prime Minister's questions in a row.
As I said, I don't know, but as I said, I don't know, it's important. Is the honourable gentleman suggesting that I don't attend the NATO summit, which I'm not in control of the dates of?
You didn't turn up for the Owen Paterson votes at all. That's right, isn't it?
I can't recall.
You didn't turn up for the Boris Johnson votes at all, did you?
No, I was at a charity dinner for Jewish care.
I think that's some cutting it fine, I would argue, since other members of Parliament who were at the same dinner with you and left after you did manage to get back for the vote.
I think, with greatest respect, I think their role and my role at the dinner probably slightly different.
You chose not to be there, didn't you? That's twice. On two rule-breaking moments, you chose not to be in Parliament. But yesterday, you opined on the rules of cricket. Take us through that.
I chose to fulfil my obligation to an incredible charity for whom that is one of their significant fundraising moments of the year.
Well, as we've heard, the Prime Minister was away from the Commons for PMQs. The deputies stood in. How did they get on?
Well, yes, I suppose the Prime Minister had a hospital pass, definitely, for those NHS celebrations. And in fact, the Labour leader was at that NHS event as well. But it didn't stop his deputy, Angela Rayner, reading something into Rishi Sunak's absence, or trying to at least.
Mr Speaker, I'm glad to see the right honourable gentleman here today. I think I'm right in saying that I have the pleasure again next week, 2 weeks on the trot. They really have given up. Every day, 4,000 families' mortgages deals expire, 100,000 more since we last met, and millions more next year. Families are sick with worry about the cost of the Tory mortgage bombshell. Do they still claim to be the party of home ownership?
It may come as a surprise to the Right Honourable Lady, but actually some leaders trust their deputies to stand in for them. When it comes to mortgage rates, I support the independence of the Bank of England taking the necessary measures to control inflation. Just ask the IMF about what we have done in support of them. They've said we have taken decisive and responsible action to bring down inflation, and we will continue to do so.
We've had 13 years of Conservative failures, and that homeowners watching that pathetic answer will be cringing that they aren't celebrating the government's success. They're counting the cost of their failures, and the only thing that's not soaring in prices at the moment is his gags that are getting cheaper by the minute. And Mr Speaker, it's not just homeowners that are suffering. Security of renters have been ripped away too, with higher mortgage costs handed directly to them. Given most renters live in homes with buy-to-let mortgage, can he tell us, are buy-to-let properties included in their mortgage support package, yes or no?
We have introduced legislation for the first time to support renters, to give them greater security of tenure, and of course the Chancellor will take all necessary measures to stand behind both mortgage holders and, of course, take necessary measures for renters.
We will ban no-fault evictions, Mr Speaker, unlike the party opposite. And Jessica and her 4 children from Plymouth were evicted from their home in April. They're temporarily living with Jessica's mother in a cramped house where her 2 eldest children are sleeping on blow-up beds in the front room surrounded by their belongings. Hardly the decent, secure life that his government promised. Don't families like Jessica deserve better?
Yes. Deputy Prime Minister.
I'll tell you what we're doing for families like Jessica's. We are increasing the national living wage. It was this party that introduced the national living wage, not the party opposite. It is this party that has doubled the personal allowance, cutting taxes for those people. And it is this party that has lifted 1 million people out of unemployment.
As we celebrate the 75th anniversary of the health services in the UK, I want to reflect on 2 quotes from 2 people. The first one is, it's about using the private sector more, something we should be very comfortable with. The second quote is, people go as NHS patients to the private sector and we could do more of it. Can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister which quote is from the PM and which is from the Leader of the Opposition?
They're both correct. Well, Mr Speaker, may I actually just begin by saying genuinely how sorry I was to hear that the Honourable Lady will be standing down at the next election. She and I joined this House at the same time, and I know she has contributed much to her party and to this place. And may I also say, I'm sure she will wish to join me in celebrating His Majesty King Charles, receiving the Scottish regalia, I think pretty much as we speak. When it comes to the NHS, I will take absolutely no lectures from either party on it. It has been there for me. I was born in an NHS hospital. My children were born in an NHS hospital. It's been there for me and my family, and this government has put record funding into it.
Very black. The Deputy Prime Minister, I thank him for his kind words, and we did join this place at the same time, and I'm pretty sure we'll be leaving at the same time.
Thank you, Susan. We'll be back with you for more from Westminster a little later. To Cardiff now, and our Wales reporter Kemlyn Davis, who's at the Senedd. Hello, Kemlyn. Now, members of the Senedd have been reacting to the evidence given by senior Welsh Government figures to the UK COVID inquiry. Tell us what's come up.
Yes, that's right. On Monday, the Chief Medical Officer for Wales and the former boss of the Welsh NHS gave evidence to the UK COVID inquiry for the first time. Then on Tuesday, it was the turn of the Welsh Labour First Minister, Mark Drakeford, and Vaughan Gething. Now, he's the Economy Minister at the moment, but he was the Health Minister for much of the pandemic. And the general theme that emerged from the evidence was that the Welsh Government wasn't as prepared as it could have been for COVID. Now, this, of course, was the UK COVID inquiry. The Welsh Government has long rejected calls for a Wales-specific inquiry, saying that the decisions taken here during the pandemic can only be put in their full and proper context as part of a UK-wide investigation. Well, on Wednesday, MSs had a chance to ask the current Health Minister about the evidence that we heard at the start of the week, with Plaid Cymru saying that it highlighted the need, once again, for a Wales-specific COVID inquiry.
The evidence that we have heard over the last 2 days shows clearly that we were badly underprepared for a pandemic. We learned that documents had not been updated for a decade. Independent scientific advice was not always followed by ministers in the pre-pandemic period. It became clear that we were woefully ill-equipped with not enough PPE, inadequate isolation rooms, and so much more. So we know these weaknesses that were in the system. They were evidenced yesterday. But we don't know why.
One thing that came from the evidence that was put forward by the government ministers yesterday was that your predecessor had not read the papers when it came to COVID preparedness or pandemic preparedness. And in fact, many journalists said that the minister was clearly floundering, and those were his words, not mine, in his responses. Can you assure the Senedd this afternoon, Minister, that you have, incoming Health Minister here in the Senedd, read your papers, you understand what is required, and that we are in the best place to be prepared should a future pandemic hit us on the scale of COVID-19 hit us?
I cannot and I will not provide a running commentary on the evidence the inquiry is taking, and I'm not going to prejudge or speculate on any of the conclusions the inquiry may come to at the end of this module. As you know, we have got this special purpose committee, and I have read the papers in relation to that.
Eluned Morgan there, and she referenced that special purpose committee that's been set up here in the Senedd that will scrutinise some of the decisions taken by the Welsh Government around COVID and the pandemic. That committee is the political compromise, if you like, in place of having a full-blown inquiry in Wales.
All right, and moving on, there's been plenty of discussion in the Senedd this week too about the NHS as it celebrates its 75th birthday.
Yes, and plenty of celebration of that birthday, but also some lively discussion around the state of the Welsh NHS at the moment and its future. This first came up during this week's session of First Minister's Questions on Tuesday, when there was a passionate speech by the Labour MS for Blaenau Gwent and the town of Tredegar, where, of course, the founder of the NHS, Aneurin Bevan, was born.
When Aneurin Bevan said he was going to Tredegarise Britain, what he meant was that his values, the values of the South Wales Valleys, the values of Labour, the values of the Tredegar Medical Aid Society would transform the lives of people up and down this country. 75 years later, those values remain true in this party, remain true in this Parliament, and remain true in this country.
Last week I met with several GPs from the region of South East Wales in the event Save Our Surgeries here in the Senedd. They gave an extremely open and frank look of some of the issues that they're facing on a daily basis. My conversations with them came after the BMA warned GP services in Wales will indeed collapse without urgent support.
If it is to last another 75 years, we must be on our guard against those who prefer to see the service in private hands on ideological grounds. We must ensure that staff are not demoralised, overworked and are given fair terms and conditions. The NHS is nothing without its staff.
So that was on Tuesday, but there was a further debate too later in the week.
Yes, this on Wednesday, a debate brought by the Welsh Conservatives calling on the Senedd to celebrate this birthday, but also to recognise the challenges facing the NHS in Wales. And that did lead to some political arguing and dare I say it, some political point scoring as well.
If the Conservatives are serious about meeting the needs of patients and staff, I suggest they have a word with Sunak and Hunt at Downing Street.
From founding the National Health Service to running it into the ground, that is the current legacy of the Labour Party here in Wales. The evidence to me is clear. We all know what the first step in a Welsh NHS revival is. That's the removal of Labour from office. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
The challenges remain, but I stand committed, along with my fellow Welsh Labour colleagues and progressives across this Senedd, to the greatest socialist ideal ever enacted in this country, our NHS.
We should all pledge to depoliticise the NHS as much as we possibly can and commit to work more collaboratively on those areas of challenge that are not unique to Wales.
We all have a role to play in protecting our NHS and ensuring that it continue to provide that essential care for the people of Wales for the next 75 years.
So a flavour there of that debate, with some Welsh Conservative MSs criticising the Welsh Labour government's handling and management of the Welsh NHS over the years, but others pointing the finger at the Conservative government in Westminster over a lack of funding. One other thing that stood out in that debate was just how eager everyone who contributed was from across the chamber to paying tribute and thanking everybody who works for the Welsh NHS.
OK, Kemlyn Davis at Cardiff Bay, thanks very much for the update. Let's return to events here at Westminster with our parliamentary correspondent Susan Hume. And Susan, MPs debated plans this week from the government to fine public bodies who initiate boycotts against Israel. What exactly is the government trying to do here?
Right, well, this bill is really aimed at the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, or BDS movement. And that movement says it wants to put international pressure on Israel over its treatment of Palestinians. I suppose what they're trying to do is a version of what happened back in the 80s, where there were boycotts against South African, that is sort of the apartheid government in South Africa, where they encourage people not to buy South African apples, that kind of thing. The government argues that public bodies like local authorities shouldn't be having their own foreign policy towards Israel in any case. However, there was a lot of concern in the Commons, across the parties actually, that this was a great deal more far-reaching and that there were real implications for free speech.
Mr. Speaker, the bill before the House today does four things. It honours a manifesto promise that this government recommitted to in the last Queen's speech. It affirms the important principle that UK foreign policy is a matter for the UK government. It ensures that local authorities concentrate on serving their residents, not directing resources inefficiently. And critically, it provides protection for minority communities, especially the Jewish community, against campaigns that harm community cohesion and fuel anti-Semitism. And it in no way circumscribes anyone's right to freedom of speech or conscience. What it does do is to prevent local authorities singling out individual nations for discriminatory treatment on the basis of an ideological opposition to that nation and its fundamental basis. The BDS movement deliberately asks public bodies to treat Israel differently from any other nation on the globe. It asks them to treat the Middle East's only democracy as a pariah state and to end links with those who have a commercial presence there.
We understand that there is something fundamentally illiberal, leftist, and with deep, ugly connections to anti-Semitism at the heart of the BDS movement. That's what we're trying to tackle today.
I agree with Labour Friends of Israel. I agree with Luke Akecrest. I agree with the Board of Deputies. I agree with the Jewish Leadership Council, all of whom back this bill. I agree with the French government and the German government that have taken action against the BDS movement. And I agree with all 50 governors of all US states, Democrat and Republican, who have also denounced the BDS movement. The question is, for every member of this House, do you stand with us against anti-Semitism or not?
Can he recognise that those of us who would like to see local authorities challenged, perhaps through the Equalities Act, can find troublesome elements of this bill? For those of us who have communities who are desperately concerned about the Uyghurs or the Rohingyas or what happened in Sri Lanka, would recognise that this legislation could stop us speaking out for them.
Under Clause 1, subsection 2, influenced by political or moral disapproval of foreign state conduct, would flying a Ukrainian flag over a town hall actually fall foul of this bill as well?
I want to start by saying to the Secretary of State that we recognise the problem that he says this bill is designed to tackle. It is therefore deeply frustrating that the government has introduced a bill that is so needlessly broad, with such sweeping draconian powers and far-reaching effects, that instead of members on all sides of this House having the opportunity today to come together and welcome long overdue action, that he is faced with genuine, legitimate, heartfelt opposition from his own benches.
The bill states that if you express in print that you would like, as an elected official, would like to boycott products from Xinjiang or China or from any illegal settlement, but you can't because the law doesn't allow you, Just making that statement constitutes an offence punishable by a yet unlimited fine from the Secretary of State.
This bill is not a considered attempt to bring about peace, provide better security for Israel, or respond to the threats posed by BDS. It's about using Jews as a pawn in the government's political game.
Well, now to a story that affects some 15 million people in the south of England, the crisis facing Thames Water. The regulator Ofwat was called in to give evidence. What did we learn from that?
Well, there were some searching questions for them. I mean, Thames Water, as you say, it's the biggest water firm in the company, but it's facing massive financial problems. It's got debt. A week or so back, it seemed to be teetering on the brink of going bust, and the chief executive stepped down very suddenly. Aside from that, it's got all those issues with dodgy old infrastructure, leaky pipes, that kind of thing. And this very week, they were fined millions of pounds for a sewage spill, which left probably thousands of fish gasping and dying on the banks of a small river near Gatwick. So, really difficult situation. What this House of Lords committee wanted to know was, you know, we've got a regulator, a watchdog, Ofwat. What were they doing all the time that these things were going wrong?
When did you hear about the position of Thames? When did you realise it was in peril?
We published our annual Monitoring Financial Resilience report on the sector in about October last year, and Thames Water was one of the companies we noted that action was required to address their financial resilience. So we considered their financial resilience wasn't adequate, and we were concerned about it. At that point in time, the company had plans to raise equity from their shareholders, something they set out in June last year, plans to raise £1.5 billion of equity. Since then, £500 million of that they have secured from their shareholders. They still need to raise further equity from the shareholders. They're in discussions with the shareholders to do so. We're in discussions with the company and its shareholders as well, and that's where the issue sits today. But in terms of, I would stress that the company does have around £4 billion of liquidity to draw on, so it's not. So we think some of the reports about their concerns about Thames have been overstated, and so the company does have, an ability to weather the present issues.
At the moment, you've got a shareholders' strike.
No, they're in discussions with the shareholders about raising that equity. How
much money do you think is required?
I think to make final judgment on that, we need to see their revised business plan, but we think it's substantial sums of money.
What you're saying is that this is really relatively recent.
Can I
I think in that context, the departure of the chief executive days before it became clear that the roof was falling in, or in danger of falling in, would suggest that there's something rather dramatic happened in the last few days or weeks before her departure.
We've been aware of Thames's poor performance, obviously for some time, for all the reasons that Ofwat have said in terms of monitoring performance. We were told about the turnaround programme. We were curious is the wrong word, but we wanted to know a lot more about that. We further expressed our concern to the board of Thames on the back end of March the 22nd. Again, we said we are very concerned about the rate of progress on this turnaround programme. You need to think about ways in which you can accelerate it. They were performing so badly, we were concerned for the customers in London about leakage and service recovery and things like that.
When was this?
Oh, throughout last year. Okay, but we knew that because they were performing so badly, we wanted to see the turnaround programme push more fastly, and whilst they're turning around, they've got reduced income because their income from customers was depressed, and the way to support the business throughout that period was further injections of equity. So we were very nervous and wanted to see answers to what are you going to do to support the business during the turnaround programme. So it was beginning to crystallise then.
We were told by Thames that they had very good plans. But we now learn that those plans didn't work. The people who ransacked the company 10 years ago were all scarpered. So there's no money left in the till.
Finally, Susan, here at Westminster, the illegal migration bill, crucial one for the government, has been in the Lords this week. What's been happening?
Yeah, we heard earlier in the programme the Prime Minister being challenged over his plans for how to stop people crossing the Channel in these small boats, and how that has run into trouble in the courts because they say it's illegal to send people off to Rwanda to be processed and maybe settled there. However, as you say, these plans also require a bill in Parliament, the illegal migration bill. That's run into heaps of trouble in the House of Lords. Got to remember, the government doesn't have a majority in the House of Lords, so it can be defeated on its legislation there. And it really has been on this one. It's had a real drubbing, about 20-odd defeats so far. Including, most unusually, this week from the Archbishop of Canterbury. He doesn't normally do that kind of thing, but he has in this. He's not very keen on the whole Rwanda plan bit of it, but actually this defeat was on a kind of a wider, more long-term thing. He thinks that the governments ought to be forced to have a strategy for migration and for how you deal with refugees, to look at things like the drivers of why people want to get in those small boats, on things like climate change and the war and the trouble that people face, and try and deal with some of these things at their root cause. He was successful. He managed to defeat ministers on that. Though I should say the bill then has to go back to the Commons, where ministers will be able to overturn those defeats.
This amendment is a combination of the two amendments that I put forward at committee stage, and requires the Secretary of State to produce a 10-year strategy for tackling the global refugee crisis and human trafficking in collaboration with international partners. And thus I hope that the government and all noble lords can see that this amendment is a positive and constructive suggestion, whatever I may feel or others may feel about the bill in general. And I urge the government to develop a strategy that is ambitious, collaborative, and worthy of our history, and up to the scale of the enormous challenges that we face.
The kind of people who support this bill and want the priority and the exclusive focus now to be on stopping the boats are the kind of people who have lost a lot of confidence in the democratic process and in the institutions of this country. If we want people to support that kind of wholesale global approach, we have to show them that we want to do this with their support, and that requires us, in the first instance, to say what matters to them matters to us.
Global challenges, and that's what they are, require global solutions. We just can't be isolationists. We need to recognise and to take responsibility for the impact of our responses in an interconnected global community.
I've certainly never seen an Archbishop move an amendment at any stage of a bill, let alone at the latter stages of such a contentious bill.
The government recognises the interconnected nature of migration and the need to work collectively. That is why this government is already engaged and working tirelessly with international and domestic partners to tackle human trafficking. And I remain to be persuaded, like my noble friends Lady Lawler and Lady Stowell, that now is the time to divert resources from that work in order to prepare, consult on, and promulgate a strategy of the kind proposed in this amendment. We will, of course, keep the case for such a strategy under review.
Thanks very much, Susan. And that's all for Politics UK for this week. Joe Coburn will be back with Politics Live on Monday at 10:15 on BBC Two and iPlayer. Goodbye.